Hi. On the morning of my wedding day, the unthinkable happened. My sister deliberately poured oil paint all over my wedding dress. My mother, instead of defending me, excused her behavior by saying, "You always steal your sister's shine." As if that betrayal wasn't enough, my maid of honor then posted the entire incident online, announcing to the world that the wedding was officially canceled. You won't believe who came across that story, and what he did next was even more shocking. My sister's cruelty was about to backfire in ways she could never have imagined. Trust me, you don't want to miss the astonishing twist that followed. I promise, every detail will be worth your time. My name is Nikita, and to understand what my sister Olivia did, you first need to grasp the strange, unspoken language of our family. It was a language never spoken in words, but written in objects. My grandmother's delicate china set, my father's treasured wristwatch, my mother's string of pearls. These weren't mere possessions. They were tokens of approval, symbols of favoritism, and declarations of who was winning the invisible competition that shaped our entire family dynamic. For as long as I can remember, Olivia was the one who received the heirlooms. She was the star, the performer, the actress whose entire life played out like a grand stage production that demanded only the finest props. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the landscape designer who worked with dirt, roots, and sunlight. My world was made of things that grew slowly, silently, and naturally, things that couldn't be locked in a cabinet or flaunted at a family gathering. My wealth lay in patience and persistence, values that held no currency in our family's economy of dazzling displays. Inevitably, this imbalance reached its climax with our weddings, both planned for the same month. I could see the collision coming, a brutal clash for the spotlight, the family's attention, and the emotional real estate of the season. So I did what I had always done. I stepped back. I rescheduled my wedding for the week after hers, imagining it as a kind of gift, a gesture of goodwill that gave her the uncontested stage she craved. But what I saw as generosity was really a dangerous mistake. In our family, an empty stage was never left alone. It was turned into a weapon. My mother, Caroline, interpreted my decision not as an act of peace, but as something far more calculating, a clever strategic retreat. In her eyes, I had given Olivia the stage first, only to arrive afterward and outshine her when the spotlight was brightest. She even mused aloud, her voice tinged with an unsettling admiration for a ruthlessness she believed lived inside me. "It's a bold move, Nikita. Very bold." The one thing I refused to surrender, however, was my dress. In a lifetime spent blending into the background, this gown was my single act of defiance, my one chance to be fully visible. I had designed the lace myself, a secret code written in thread. Each motif was intentional. Delicate ferns that stood for resilience, the quiet strength I had nurtured in silence, and blossoms of night-blooming jasmine, representing the dreams I allowed myself only when the world was dark and still. This wasn't just fashion, it was my story. The seamstress who brought it to life understood that she wasn't stitching fabric alone. She was giving shape to a soul. Every fold and every stitch carried meaning. For the first time, I felt I had created an heirloom of my own, something born not of inheritance, but of identity. And I guarded it with a fierce, protective passion. The morning of my wedding arrived cloaked in tension, the kind I had known all my life. Olivia lingered like a restless ghost at the feast, her silence a sharp, almost electrical frequency of resentment. She floated through the joyful chaos of last-minute preparations, her very presence pulling warmth and laughter from every room she entered. I stood in my slip, hair pinned and makeup complete, my heart fluttering like a trapped bird as the moment approached. Soon I would step into the dress that was more than silk and lace. It was a declaration. I stepped out of the room for only a moment, just long enough to retrieve my veil, a small, delicate piece of tool that I had chosen for its quiet simplicity. When I returned, the sight that awaited me stole the breath from my lungs and froze me in place. There was Olivia, standing before my gown as if before an altar. The dress hung from the doorframe, luminous and fragile, a sacred artifact awaiting its consecration. In her hand glinted a tube of cadmium-red oil paint. A thick, jagged stroke of crimson slashed from the bodice's intricate lace straight down the flowing silk skirt. It was obscene, a wound carved into fabric, gleaming wet under the light like fresh blood. She had not merely stained it, she had desecrated it, an act of violence performed with theatrical precision. When she turned to face me, I searched for hesitation, remorse, even shame. There was none. Only triumph, cold, glittering, merciless. This was her masterpiece, her crowning cruelty, her final act on a stage she had built entirely out of spite. Her voice came soft, almost tender in its theatrical malice. "It was too plain," she murmured, "all that white. It needed a little life, a little tragedy." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only when my mother entered, drawn by the unnatural stillness. Her gaze swept the room in a single stroke. The ruined dress, Olivia's smug, unrepentant stance, and me, standing hollow-eyed, my face shattered into disbelief. For the briefest moment, I saw a flicker in her expression. Horror, pity, maybe even recognition of the cruelty unfolding before her. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, smothered under the iron certainty that had defined her all my life. Her loyalty, as always, returned to its familiar orbit. Olivia. Her words cut sharper than any blade. They were not a balm, but an indictment. "Well, Nikita," she said coolly, each syllable deliberate, "you shouldn't have provoked her." Provoked her? Mom, what? The words stumbled out of me, my mind grasping wildly for sense. But she pressed on, her voice rising, shifting from judgment to outright alliance with Olivia's madness. "This is what happens when you push her. You and this perfect, quiet little life you've built. You had to have this perfect dress, something no one else could have. You just couldn't stand it, could you? You couldn't let her have her wedding month without trying to steal her shine." The accusations struck like blows to the chest, stripping me of breath, of reason, of defense. In that moment, I wasn't merely the victim of my sister's jealousy. I was being cast as its cause, the accomplice to my own undoing. The dress might be scrubbed, perhaps even salvaged, but my mother's words carved a wound deeper than oil paint could ever reach. That was the true betrayal. And as the weight of her judgment settled over me, I felt the ground beneath my life give way. It wasn't sudden. It was the final devastating confirmation of a truth I had spent years refusing to accept. In my mother's world, I would never be the chosen one. In the unwritten script of my family's saga, I had always been, and would forever remain, the villain. My maid of honor, Sarah, had been lingering quietly in the hallway, a silent witness to the entire execution of my dignity. While I stood frozen, my mind fracturing and drifting as the room tilted into a blur, she became the embodiment of calm, decisive force. She didn't waste words. Instead, she raised her phone with steady hands and captured one clear photograph of the ruined gown, a single frame that preserved the crime in irrefutable detail. Then she slipped her arm through mine. Her touch was solid, grounding, the only reality that held me together in that moment. "We're leaving," she said, her tone low, steady, commanding. And just like that, she steered my trembling body out of that house, away from the acrid stench of oil paint, away from the oppressive weight of betrayal, and into the clean anonymity of her car. An hour later, I found myself perched on the edge of a sterile hotel bed, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of detergent. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving behind only tremors that slowly ebbed into a cavernous, hollow ache. That was when Sarah's phone buzzed. She turned the screen toward me. The photograph was already online, paired with a statement as stark as it was unflinching. Due to a deliberate and malicious act of vandalism by a close family member, the wedding of Nikita and Robert is canceled. We ask that you respect their privacy. Sarah hadn't done it to humiliate my sister or to strike back in vengeance. She had done it to shield me, to cauterize the wound before the flood of questions and speculation could pour in. But in trying to protect me, she had tossed a spark into dry kindling. And I was about to learn that stories like mine didn't simply vanish. They ignited. They spread like wildfire. And within those flames, the life I thought had ended was already being reforged into something new, something I could never have predicted. The first message came like a flare in the night. It wasn't from a relative or a sympathetic friend. It was from Julian Croft. Even through the fog of grief and disbelief, the name snapped me awake. Julian Croft wasn't just another influencer. He was a phenomenon, an arbiter of culture, a digital age tastemaker with millions who hung on his every word about design, art, and authenticity. His brand was built on celebrating true craftsmanship and mercilessly exposing pretenders. His message was blunt, stripped of sympathy. I just saw the post from your friend Sarah. That lace pattern was a work of art. To destroy it with something as crude as oil paint is not just an attack on a wedding. It's an offense against craftsmanship itself. Do not let an act of barbarism be the final word on your story. I stared at the words, my first reaction a bitter laugh of disbelief. Surely this was some surreal hallucination, my mind grasping at fantasies in the wake of trauma. But then more messages followed. From him. From his producers. They weren't offering condolences. They were proposing something else entirely. A counterattack. A phone call was arranged. When his voice finally filled my ear, it was exactly as it was on his broadcasts. Resonant, commanding, woven with conviction. Nikita, he began, steady and sure. Your wedding was not canceled. It was postponed by an act of jealousy. There is a difference. What was attacked was not merely your dress, but the very principle of creating something beautiful, something deeply personal. My audience, the people who follow me, they don't just consume content. They believe. They believe in artistry over artifice. And right now, they are furious on your behalf. He was right. By the time Sarah refreshed the screen, her original post had mutated from a somber announcement into a blazing viral inferno. Julian had shared it with his vast audience, adding only one razor-sharp line. This is what happens when talentless narcissism collides with genuine creativity. The effect was explosive. The comment section roared to life, thousands of voices rising in outrage, in solidarity, in fierce defense of what had been destroyed. My private tragedy had transformed overnight into a public parable about cruelty, envy, and the fragility of beauty. Julian's proposal was nothing short of audacious. "We are going to give you a new wedding," he declared with unshakable conviction. "Not as a pity gift, but as a platform. We will turn this moment into a live event, a testament that creation will always triumph over destruction. I'll handle the logistics. All you need to do is say yes." I hesitated. The thought of turning something as intimate as a wedding into a spectacle for the world felt almost sacrilegious. But then I turned to Robert. My fiancé, my anchor, looked at me with the same quiet steadiness that had carried me through every storm. "The wedding was never about the venue or the dress," he said softly. "It was about us. That hasn't changed. Everything else is just noise. Let's not let them silence the music." So I said, "Yes." The next 72 hours became a whirlwind orchestrated with military precision. Julian's team moved like a finely tuned machine, mobilizing designers, vendors, and media outlets. My ruined dress was no longer the focal point. My story was. And Julian knew exactly how to weaponize it. A world-renowned fashion designer, celebrated for her sculptural, architectural gowns, reached out after seeing the post. She offered to create a new dress, calling it an emergency artistic intervention. The original venue, a modest garden I had chosen for its intimacy, was replaced by something far grander, the city's botanical conservatory. A breathtaking glass cathedral brimming with exotic flora. It was a living, breathing sanctuary that resonated with my work as a landscape designer on a level that felt almost fated. Julian secured it with a single phone call. But the most extraordinary shift was in the guest list. As Julian documented every step of the resurrection, something unexpected happened. People began asking if they could attend. At first, it was a trickle. A few curious admirers who wanted to witness the ending of a story that had gripped them. But soon the trickle became a flood. They didn't just want to watch the live stream, they wanted to be there. They wanted to stand in the room as witnesses, to take part in an act of collective defiance against cruelty. What had been planned as a private gathering of 75 was morphing into something far larger, a public rally for decency, a celebration of resilience. The sabotage that was meant to diminish me, to reduce my world to a single moment of shame, had detonated in reverse. My world wasn't shrinking, it was expanding, exploding outward in light and noise and possibility. Amid the chaos, I caught a quiet, piercing thought. The irony was almost unbearable. My sister had spent her entire life clawing for attention, fabricating spotlights, treating our family as stagehands in her endless, exhausting performance. And yet, with one single act of petty destruction, she had given me a spotlight so vast, so brilliant, it illuminated not just me, but the entire country. She hadn't stolen my shine. She had handed me the sun. By Saturday, the exact date I was meant to be married, I stood for the final fitting of the gown. It was magnificent, a structured creation of silk and shimmering thread, less like clothing and more like armor. It was not a dress of naive dreams, but of battle and survival, woven with defiance. The first wedding had been my private hope, a quiet dream nurtured in secret. This new wedding was different. It was no longer just about me and Robert. It was a story. And the entire world was watching, breathless, to see how it would end. The day of the new wedding felt less like real life and more like stepping into a parallel universe. The Botanical Conservatory, a place I had admired for years only from a professional distance, had been utterly transformed. Julian's production team, an army of discreet professionals dressed in black, moved like shadows, adjusting cameras and lights with a reverence that enhanced the natural majesty of the glass cathedral rather than overshadowing it. The exotic plants glowed under the subtle illumination, every leaf and petal shimmering as if the entire building itself had been waiting for this moment. But it wasn't the beauty of the space that stole my breath. It was the guests. Hundreds of strangers from every corner of life had gathered, dressed in their finest clothes, their faces alive with a radiant, genuine excitement. They hadn't come to watch passively. They had come to participate, to bear witness, to lend their presence like a collective benediction. From a secluded balcony, Sarah and I gazed down at them, overwhelmed. She leaned close and whispered, "Olivia wanted an audience. I guess she got one. For you instead." There was no venom in her tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of cosmic justice finally delivered. Julian found me just before the ceremony began. His sharp eyes swept over my gown, a breathtaking fusion of regality and intimacy, and he gave a single approving nod. "Perfection," he said simply. "Are you ready?" I drew in a long, steadying breath. I'm ready to marry Robert, I answered softly. The rest, all of this, it's just a beautiful dream I never knew I was allowed to have. The walk down the aisle was nothing short of surreal. Every gaze turned toward me, but for once it was not the cold scrutiny of a family's judgment. It was warmth. It was encouragement. I saw faces of strangers who had followed the story from the beginning, who knew of the ruined dress and the defiance that rose from its ashes. Their smiles glowed. Some eyes shimmered with tears. They were not merely a crowd. They were my witnesses. They were my community. At the end of the aisle stood Robert, waiting with a look that made my knees weak, an expression woven from awe, devotion, and steady, unwavering love. In a week where everything else had shifted beneath my feet, he was the one constant, the axis of my world. The ceremony, broadcast live to millions, unfolded with quiet power. We didn't reference the chaos of the past week outright, but its shadow gave meaning to every phrase. Our vows spoke of resilience, of the beauty that rises from brokenness, of the kind of love that doesn't need a spotlight because it generates its own light. My words to Robert were my final answer to the silent competition my family had forced upon me. Love, unlike attention, is not something to be hoarded or stolen. It is something built, steady, and luminous from the inside out. By the time the final kiss was sealed, the broadcast had already gone viral. Our wedding trended to the #1 spot in the nation. News outlets scrambled to cover it, desperate for a rare story of hope and triumph. What had begun as a personal catastrophe had become a public anthem of resilience. I, Nikita, the quiet landscape designer, the overlooked sister, had, for one dazzling day, stolen the shine not from Olivia, not from my family, but from the entire nation. We never heard from my family again. Not a frantic phone call, not a trembling message of apology, not even a hollow plea for forgiveness. Their defeat arrived not in the form of some climactic confrontation, but as something quieter and far more devastating: irrelevance. I could picture them in their carefully curated living room, surrounded by heirlooms and polished surfaces, watching my wedding on a screen just as millions of strangers did. They had reduced themselves to spectators in my life. And now, that was all they would ever be. Their power over me had once felt absolute, but only because my world had been small enough for them to occupy every corner of it. In trying to destroy that fragile world, they had unwittingly catapulted me into one so vast that their reach could not even graze the edges. They had not merely lost control, they had lost significance. Later that night, as Robert and I stood together on a terrace overlooking the conservatory's illuminated gardens, the glass walls glowing like a lantern in the dark, my thoughts drifted back to the ruined dress. Once, it had seemed like a devastating loss, a symbol of everything stolen from me, but now I saw it differently. It was not a tragedy. It was a discarded skin, a relic of a past I no longer mourned. Olivia's act of malice, intended as the final defining chapter of my story, had been stripped of its power. What she had tried to end had instead been transformed into a beginning. That scarlet slash of paint, meant to humiliate and destroy, had become only a footnote, overshadowed by the far grander, brighter, and more beautiful narrative I had just begun to write.